After that very invigorating talk early in the morning, thank you, Megan, I now invite Professor Kian Woon Kwok, who is the Associate Professor, who is the Associate Provost of the President's Office and part of the Division of Sociology at Nanyang Technological University in Singapore.
Thank you. My thanks to the organizers for inviting me to participate in this plenary. I'm privileged to report that I was one of Beng Huat's earliest undergraduates in Singapore. So, I must be one of the oldest card-carrying members of the Chua Beng Huat fan club. I understand that a young member of this club stopped short of deifying him because theologically, Christianity did not allow this man to worship another god. So I think we must all resist the temptation of uncritical adoration. When Beng Huat comes to NTU, the students all line up to take pictures with him. Okay, I think it was useful for Megan to establish what might be called some elements in a intellectual biography. There will be no time for us to do that in any comprehensive way. But certainly, I think a quick tour of this would trace the trajectory from Bukit Ho Swee to Kent Ridge. Bukit Ho Swee being perhaps one of the poorest areas in Singapore, and also the site for massive urban change. Kent Ridge is another story. And of course, as a post-war baby boomer, the kind of transformation throughout the decades with his early education in Singapore, education in Canada, of which has been referred to, a very, very short stint at the HDB, and then US, and of course IACS. I think there's no need to belabor the point, although I just want to say that I think in Bukit Ho Swee, Beng Huat experienced growing up in a large and entrepreneurial family, which has businesses, among which is pig rearing, if I'm not wrong. Yeah? And in something of a traditional kampong, for which he would have no nostalgia for. So, I want to zero in on a body of literature which Beng Huat has contributed to, which somewhat sits not so clearly in relation to his work on popular culture. And that is a work which goes back to his book on communitarian ideology and democracy in Singapore. This was in the mid-90s. Right up to a few years ago, his work on disrupting liberal hegemony in East Asia. I think in the interest of time, I will focus on this. Although I must say that a fuller assessment of Beng Huat's work must, in this connection, in the whole question of communitarianism, link it concretely to his work on housing, and not just housing in Singapore, but what in 1872 Friedrich Engels calls in a political tract the housing question, which has everything to do with issues related to communitarianism and liberalism. Just for good measure, Engels says in his tract, the bourgeoisie has only one method of solving the housing question, and this method called Houseman, the practice that has become general of making breaches in the working class quarters of our big towns, and particularly in the centrally situated areas. The breeding places of disease, the infamous holes and cellars in which the capitalist mode of production confines our workers night after night are not abolished. They are merely shifted elsewhere. The same economic necessity that produced them in the first place produces them in the next place. And if David Harvey is right, and I believe he is, this process still goes on in many, many cities across the world, and perhaps not just in the so-called third world. But, so I think housing is something that deserves more time unto itself. But let me just, before I go into this question of liberalism and communitarianism, pick up on what Megan very nicely highlighted, and the whole question of Beng Huat's earlier training in Canada and how it has informed practically the rest of his academic vocation, including in teaching. And I think as a teacher ourselves, I think this is to be appreciated. In one document, in one writing which many of you would not have, which is simply the kinds of things that we wrote, that we tend to write when we are asked to, for, in this case, for secondary school children, and supposedly the gifted ones. Yeah? Beng Huat says, to see a society as constructed by social conventions is to realize that the social reality before us is not fixed in nature. It's never naturally so. It is to realize that social reality is malleable. That is, it can be changed, and indeed it is changing all the time. These changes are brought about by human agencies and human purposes. They are the result of collective human action and will change according to human action. As a colleague of mine says, sociology is the study of the history of the present. That colleague is me. To which I follow up and say, sociology is also the study of the present as history. And this element of futurity in Beng Huat's work, which he continues here, right, is to sociologists examine how and why the present reality comes to be what it is. But that's not all they do. They ask, how can the rules and therefore the existing reality can be changed? They're interested in not only examining the present, but also oriented to examining the possible changes in the future. Therefore, in that famous essay on nostalgia for the kampong, Beng Huat, towards the end of the essay, contrasts nostalgia with utopia. Because of that element of futurity in utopia, and whatever our criticisms about mindless utopianism that has led to great disasters and so on, that element, I think, has a grain of truth that needs to be registered. So, there are elements of this, what you might call an intellectual style, deconstruction of the rules of the game, attention to everyday life, assessing the possible transformations that may be taking place at any time, and most of all, the possibilities for making choices. I was about to say that this idea of human choices, human action, human agency, when I read that in Beng Huat, I tell myself, it's as humanist as he will ever get. In many other respects, temperamentally, he would be probably an anti-foundationalist postmodernist. But in practice, I think he's a good progressive modernist. And here we come to the question of liberalism and communitarianism. And I think if we want to cut through a number of writings, including, I think I can trace the line from his book in the mid-1990s on Singapore communitarian ideology. In 2004, he wrote a little essay, The Influence of Communitarian Politics in Southeast Asia. Quickly after that, when he was in Murdoch, he wrote a working paper, Taking Group Rights Seriously. Then some 5 years later, in 2010, you have two essays here, Group Rights and Democracy in Southeast Asia, and that was in a book on East Asia's New Democracies, and of course the essay Disrupting Hegemonic Liberalism. in East Asia. And just very quickly, this is what he says here. This is how he ended that particular essay, Disrupting Liberal Hegemony. My plea is for liberal political theorists, in the spirit of liberalism, to recognize the possibility of a different basis of organizing modern democratic capitalist societies that may be equally effective in bringing happiness to its citizens. Now, there we have an intellectual agenda, and one which I would be very keen to contribute to, because when I returned from Berkeley in the late 80s, Beng and I also engaged in a series of discussions about the kinds of communitarian critiques of liberalism that were just coming on to the scene in the early 80s. You have McIntyre, you have Charles Taylor, of course, Michael Sandel in the area of political philosophy. You have Robert Bella in sociology, and of course Ed Zoini, who has been some kind of father of American communitarianism. And of course in economics, you have Amartya Sen. And throughout this body of work, there is a concern which appears, which somehow is relatively silent, although as a term, but not as a substantive concern in Beng Huat's work. And that is the whole question of justice and social justice. Again, I think issues of housing in relation to capitalism, inequality, the whole question of welfare and state intervention is part of this larger problematic. Now, another way in which that intellectual ambition is expressed is in this other 2010 article, where he says, when he refers to this rethreading of the idea of community and communitarianism as a resurrection of, quote-unquote, socialism that enables us to deterritorialize these concepts beyond Asia into a social science concept that has greater, if not universal, application. Indeed, there is no reason why the concept should not be endowed with universalizing ambition, as was the case with liberalism in the West. It is in this juxtaposition to the same ambition against Western liberalism that political analysis of Asian nations can contribute to the substantive knowledge and theorization of politics. Now, I think we are on to something terribly important here. And the worst critique against this ambition, which I do not hold, is to see this as a kind of more sophisticated Western versus Asian values and so on, of which I would like to see this kind of discourse way past. Yeah? But I would also like to highlight a number of points from what I've learned from the so-called Western discourse. And in particular, I'd like to also highlight, perhaps as a kind of critical intervention here, that perhaps we should not think of Western in relation only to the United States of America and North America more generally. Because there are traditions, European, social democratic, socialist, corporatist, Nordic, whatever, which has inflections very different from what you see in America. So, a less strong version of what Beng Huat has set out in this ambition would be someone like Amartya Sen, who says that similar or closely linked ideas of justice, fairness, responsibility, duty, goodness, and rightness have been pursued in many different parts of the world. I can think of South Africa, for example. which can expand the reach of arguments that have been considered in Western literature. And the global presence of such reasoning is often overlooked or marginalized in the dominant traditions of contemporary Western discourse. So, yes, there is intellectual work to be done. And I also wonder whether that work can be done within the confines of particular disciplines. I think noticeably weak in Singapore and perhaps elsewhere has been the interrelationship between the social sciences and philosophy, and in particular, political philosophy. When we talk about power and politics, we're talking about phenomena which have to be oriented towards some ends, human ends. I mean, in this sense, I think Michael Sandel is right to say that the relationship between political philosophy and the world and reality is something which is to look at. We talk about being unable to live up to our ideals and so on. But as he says here, if political philosophy is unrealizable in one sense, it is unavoidable in another. This is the sense in which philosophy inhabits the world from the start. Our practices and institutions are embodiments of theory. To engage in a political practice is really to stand in relation to theory. And this is why in our theorizing, including in our teaching, the whole question of what are the stakes in theorizing. And I would not touch on this in relation to the question of the study of popular culture and cultural studies. But I see Megan, for example, placing that kind of central question on the table. And as can be seen, illustrated too in Beng Huat's work. Now, I'll try to be quick here. Beng Huat's what might be called critical communitarianism, because communitarianism too has an affinity with negative phenomena such as corruption, certainly with authoritarianism, in the whole question of who defines the collective interest. But I think one very serious area in which communitarianism in its Asian forms and this is what Beng Huat highlights, has been manifested, is the whole question of group rights and, very seriously, the management of violence. Now, I think a very dramatic, perhaps traumatic example that we see today, of course, is Myanmar. The euphoria over Aung San Suu Kyi's rise, and the idea of the military steering the country out of its pariah status, only to be followed by the whole question of what do we do with groups which are not part of the Burmese nation. And I'm of course referring to the Rohingya Muslims and so on. So, in the little time I have, now it's 1 minute, could I just say that I see some kind of disjuncture. If we can only see in the sustained intellectual effort of one person, engagement with such an agenda, and yet also with very contemporary phenomena related to popular culture, consumption culture, how do these link together? It seems to me, and also with the housing question, it seems to me it needs a more explicit attention to issues of justice. And in Singapore and all over, right? And now we are talking about Turkey, certainly Egypt today, Brazil, and so on. Question of group rights and individual rights. In some ways, in the American discourse, there is, and this is not to downplay the differences, in some ways, the liberal tradition in America and what might be called the civic republic Republican tradition, the one emphasizing individual rights, the other emphasizing the common good. In some ways, these have been sibling rivals which have become incoherent. So, for example, and this I will end off with this. Yeah, time's up. Yeah? For example, if we talk about the civil rights movement of the 1960s, as Sandel puts out, it could be justified by liberals in the name of human dignity and respect for persons. But it could also be justified by communitarians in the name of recognizing the full membership of fellow citizens wrongly excluded in the common life of the nation. And when, for example, welfare and housing and the time of global capital flows and labor migration is devoted to citizenship welfare, then you have questions like what was screamed here. It comes back to who is included and who is excluded, and in what name. The name of human rights, individual rights, community, and perhaps even a wider community beyond the nation. Thank you.